Good evening, ladies, and welcome to our Genesis Bible study. I wanted to do a little introduction to the overall book of Genesis before actually beginning our first session together, largely because I wanted to give you a little advanced prep to sort of set the bigger picture agenda of what I hope we can do together and how to read the book of Genesis. And hopefully with that in hand, you'll be able to begin reading the various segments that we'll assign and hold the bigger picture in mind as you go. So just an introduction to the book of Genesis. Obviously, it's a foundational text for the rest of the Bible, and this is a very obvious reason for why we should read it and become familiar with it. I think many times we avoid Genesis because it has lots of stories in it that don't completely make sense to us, and that have also been perhaps interpreted or used in many different ways by different groups of people. And so we do the safe and convenient thing and just sort of stay away. But being good scholars and committed Christians, I think this is a neat opportunity for us to read those stories with fresh eyes. And so I encourage you, as you engage this book, to do it with a blank slate as much as possible. Keep in mind the things that you've been told in the past, but maybe set those to the side as you encounter these stories again for the first time. Genesis literally means beginnings, so it's a very appropriate book. It sort of sits with the first 5 books of the Bible. It's the sort of the introduction to those 5 books of the Bible that are called the Pentateuch. So it's sort of the intro to the Pentateuch. We're not completely sure who wrote Genesis. The best hypothesis is that it could have been Moses, but that doesn't necessarily mean it was Moses. Genesis is actually written anonymously, which is very interesting. It does not identify its own author. And so we sort of sit with that tension, wondering who wrote this and why did they write it? Genesis obviously starts before there are any humans, so it is not an eyewitness story, nor is it even a journalist story, as, say, Luke was. The author does not claim to have interviewed the characters who were eyewitnesses of this, and much of what is included in the book of Genesis, there was not an eyewitness necessarily of, or there would be no way to be able to verify. So unlike Luke's gospel, it doesn't start with any sort of claim of verification or anything like this. It actually doesn't even tell us why it's being written. But one of the things as you begin to get into Genesis, you will notice is that it's a story that explains how things came to be and why things are the way they are now. And this is very similar to many of the ancient Near Eastern myths that were written by different cultures, that were all trying to get at explaining, how did our world come to be? What is this world all about? What is its trajectory? What is its purpose? Who are people? Are there God? Is there a God? Are there gods? What is their nature? What is their order? What is their relationship to what we can see and feel and touch? So in many ways, Genesis could be called a theological history. So it's told in a way that sounds very much like a myth. And when we think of myths, we think of Greek myths, we think of Roman myths or Egyptian myths that end up sounding a lot like Genesis, particularly the opening chapters of Genesis. And these are intended to be histories that are told in a chronological order of this happened, and then this happened, and then this person did this, and as a result, this happened. So it's told as a history, but it's told as an explanatory history or a theological history. And it's answering the questions that we may or may not have thought to ask. So actually becoming aware of those questions. How did this world come to be? Why are things the way they are now? Who is God? Who are we? How are we meant to be on this earth? What went wrong? How is it in the process of being made right? Those sorts of questions are excellent to sit with as you read the book, because the book is sort of answering them, even though it never asks them. One of the questions that it really focuses in on is God. What is God like? What pleases or displeases him? How does he relate to us? And also, who are the foundational characters in our human history? And so Genesis, in a way, begins with the story of God and the angelic beings, and then sort of layers down to the story of the natural order that we can see, the earth, its plants, its animals, and the humans, and the beginning of the human race. And then slowly it narrows to a particular race or nation of people, the descendants of Abraham. And you'll notice this sort of perpetual narrowing in the chronology to sort of follow a particular family, and generation by generation, how they developed, how the events and promises and teachings and experiences of one generation got passed on and developed within the next generation. So in some ways, it's who are the foundational characters in human history, but also who are the foundational characters of the Christian faith. What do their lives show about why we are here, and how we are to understand God in this world, and how we're to navigate life in this world? So one of the goals of our study is going to be getting to know Genesis as a foundational text for the rest of the Bible. A second goal that I have, and I'm wanting to hold these two in tension, is to actually develop our ability to read the Bible, to sort of learn how to read the Bible. And that kind of falls into sort of three categories that I'll be emphasizing during our time together. First of all, how to interpret genre. We understand with different forms of literature that you have to read them differently. Some are meant to be read literally, some are meant to be read figuratively, some are meant to be read slowly, looking for deeper hidden meanings like poetry. And some are meant to be read on a very data surface level. So how to interpret genre. And again, I identified that the genre of Genesis is sort of a myth and sort of a history. And the being myth doesn't mean it didn't happen, but the way it's presented to us is going to sound more like the way a history would have been told in the ancient Near East, particularly one that was told orally and passed on from generation to generation around campfires, from parents to children, so that they can hold on to this ancient knowledge. Another way that we'll be learning to read the Bible is how to engage story or narrative. Coming from a Western modernist tradition, we may be more comfortable learning through propositional teaching, which is why many of the epistles sort of sit a little bit more naturally with us, where there's the direct point and then the counterpoint and the evidence, and you build sort of a logical argument. Genesis doesn't give us any of that. It gives us a whole bunch of stories, so we can read them and think, well, these are fun for teaching Sunday school children, but what are we to come away with understanding from these stories? And so we will practice sort of how to engage narrative, particularly narrative within the context of ancient Near Eastern storytelling. And I'll send you a link for a Bible Project video that kind of opens our eyes to that way of storytelling and how it was meant to be listened to. But one of those is that it intentionally leaves out a lot of information, which may seem like very important and relevant information that we would think should absolutely be included. But it's intentional. It's not dumb. It's actually a very advanced storytelling form. And we are meant, as the listeners, on one hand, to use our imaginations to fill in those blanks. Now, that's a little bit dangerous, because the way I fill in the blanks with my imagination may be different from the way you do, or someone sitting in a different context does. And this is where it's important to recognize the difference between the context in which we're sitting in this century, this millennia, on this continent, in this country, versus where the original listeners to this story would have been sitting, which means that we have different filters on. So our imaginations will not always fill things in the way that the storyteller would have imagined that we would. So as much as we're able to get back into that world and that context, it helps us imagine things the way they were meant to be. But it also does include very particular details. And sometimes these can seem random. You think, what? Well, you didn't tell me this, this, and this, but you're mentioning this. Well, that's intentional. And so when the details are given to us in these stories, they're to be held on to. They're clues. And often our work is to sort of solve this mystery of what is the narrator trying to get me to notice by including these particular details? How are they focusing my attention in desiring that I come away with an interpretation of this story? So I'm listening to the story, but I'm also interpreting the story as the narrator guides my vision, my focus, my imagination. So a lot of engaging narrative has to do with asking the right questions. How do we know they're the right questions? We won't necessarily, but it does take sort of getting into this world and being like children sitting at the foot of a storyteller, asking questions of, well, why did they do that? Why didn't he say this? What happened next? Asking those questions delight the heart of the storyteller because they actually tease out the themes and the meanings that are underneath the surface. Finally, as we learn how to read the Bible, especially this genre of the Bible, we pay attention to tracking themes. And this is one of the things that I'll craft questions for you to try to help you notice and pay attention to key themes and then tease them out almost like strands of thread running through a beautifully woven tapestry. Watch where they pop up and where they seem to submerge for a while. And then just when you think they're gone, they pop up again. One of the ways to notice which themes to track is notice which words or phrases or imagery or concepts get repeated or emphasized. How are they emphasized? Maybe they're the focal point of a particular story. Sometimes, anytime there's a promise given or someone is named and we're told the meaning of their name, those are kind of little clues of this is something to pay attention to. Watch for how this is going to come out again. Often themes happen in the sort of the shape of a story that happens one way, and then later on you notice, hey, wait a minute, I've seen this plot before, but this has a little twist on it or an inversion. So start paying attention to those, and you'll notice some of the fascinating things going on in this story and in the way the storyteller is telling it to us. Our perspective in reading Genesis this time is not to get into a bunch of textual criticism. We're not going to try to track down who wrote this, who modified it, what was their agenda. Instead, we're just going to sit inside the text and accept it as it presents itself to us. So we're not going to try to stand outside the story and judge it. Instead, we're going to enter into it with our imaginations and look around at the landscape of it and let the narrative itself guide the questions we're asking of it, rather than us imposing our perspectives on it. Well, that's not scientific, or that, has been disproven by that. We're not sitting as judges. We're sitting as recipients and just seeking to see and to understand what it is that this text is wanting to present to us. So as you go over the next 10 sessions, several months together, there are 5 themes I'd like to invite you to pay attention to, and hopefully we'll tease these out in our discussions together. 5 themes. First of all, humans' personal relationship with God. There are going to be a lot of different people. We'll start with creation and Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel, and sort of fast forward to Noah, and then narrow down just to one of Noah's sons, to Shem, and then a little bit of genealogy into one of his descendants, Abraham, and then we'll get Isaac, Jacob, and then among Jacob's 12 sons, we'll focus in on Joseph. And by the end of Genesis, which is 50 chapters, we'll be in Egypt with Joseph. So it will be increasingly located and increasingly narrowed to certain fingers of the human family. But track as you go the relationship with these different individuals, especially the individuals who are spotlighted, have with God, how they communicate with God, how God communicates with them, how they respond to each other, and how that relationship develops in the lifetime and through the circumstances of each of these main characters. And see them sort of not just within the lifetime of each of these people, but also within the span of the human race up to that point. We'll also be tracking interpersonal relationships. That's the second theme to track. It's the relationship between humans and humans, between brothers, between a husband and his wife, between parents and their children, between people within communities, between nations and tribes and races as these begin to develop and expand and materialize as separate entities. Have a look at interpersonal relationships. Third theme will be the theme of blessing and cursing. And this is maybe a little bit of a foreign concept to us sitting in our place in time and history, but this is a very central theme to the ancient world, especially understanding the words as having spiritual power. So words of blessing and words of cursing become, in a way, I don't want to say self-fulfilling prophecies, but spiritually fulfilled prophecies. And also blessing and cursing sometimes as a statement of simply how things are going to be as a consequence of what has happened. A fourth theme to watch for is that of righteousness and sin. And we'll track that theme even just in kind of understanding what is righteousness. What is it that makes something right or righteous? And what is it that makes something sinful? And how do these two, not just concepts, but sort of forces or states of being play out in human flourishing and the human experience? And then finally, our fifth theme we'll be tracking is the role of humans in God's unfolding story. With this sort of ongoing back and forth, how do humans affect the story that God is writing for the world? Not just how is God influencing the human story. So those are 5 themes to track over our next few months together. I will send along some additional resources that you'll want to pay attention to. If you want to just read through the book of Genesis in your Bible, that is all you need to do. For our first session, I'm asking you to read Genesis 1 to 3. Ordinarily, we'll read 5 chapters, but these first 3 are so foundational, I think we'll just cover them. If you happen to have a study Bible, that would be a great thing to use. A study Bible is sort of a Bible that has all the text of the scripture, but you'll notice at the bottom of it will be all these little notes and references, and you'll notice little sort of letters, sometimes italicized letters, up in the text as you're reading it, and you just follow those as a key and find the notes at the bottom of your page and just read up on them. And they're really interesting notes. Sometimes they'll explain what a particular word means, or sometimes they'll tell you other ways that other texts interpret that same phrase or word, or they'll tell you where this location is or where else this is mentioned in the Bible. And so it kind of gives a lot of extra information just as you're working your way through the text, not interpreting it, but just giving more information that exists within Scripture. So if you have a study Bible, or you may want to get a study Bible, that can be really, really helpful. It's different from a commentary. If you want more than that, there is one commentary that I'm recommending. You don't have to use it. We won't do a lot with it, but it's by Tremper Longman, and I'll write it up in the email I send you. It's the Story of God Bible Commentary. And I like this commentary because it really engages Genesis as a story and helps us understand a little bit more of the context in which it was written. And that opens our eyes to how this story was meant to be heard. If you end up getting this commentary, you may want to read the first 24 pages, which offer a lovely introduction to the book of Genesis. I'll also be sending you some links to some Bible Project videos, little 3 to 5 minute clips that give you more information on the background of Genesis. I hope I haven't overwhelmed you. And I hope that this will be a lovely time for all of us. God bless you.